I did my master's degree at the University of Chicago with the Committee on Human Development in clinical psychology. And that program had a psychology and sociology and a biological science component in it. And after I got my master's, I went to the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana to study school and clinical psychology, and earned a Ph.D. in 1971, and then went into practice as a school psychologist, and then I established my own private practice. But by 1980, I was pretty well burned out from stress when I was still in my early 40s. And fortunately, I had a friend and colleague, a Ph.D. educator, who urged me to get a hair analysis because my health was in terrible shape. And the first hair analysis showed that I had a critical deficiency of magnesium that put me at high risk for diabetes and for a heart attack. So that, of course, got my attention, and I started taking magnesium and other supplements and rebalanced my blood sugar and drastically reduced my risk for heart attack as I built my magnesium level, monitoring it with repeated hair analyses. And then I began studying hair analysis with Dr. Paul Eck and Dr. David Watts at Analytic Research Labs in Phoenix. And they were my mentors in the early to mid-'80s, and I learned the very basic concepts and principles of working with hair analysis. And I found that the hair analysis really lent itself very well to a psychological practice because most psychological problems have a strong component of stress. And the hair analysis minerals reflect the person's reactions to stress. So I found it to be a very, very good psychological tool as well as a physiological and metabolic tool. And then I continued to learn and eventually began doing some research and writing and publishing about hair analysis beginning in 1994. And I presented papers at the American Psychological Association showing how minerals are related to stress and psychological functionings. And then in 2002 and 2003, I wrote my book, The Strands of Health, A Guide to Understanding Hair Mineral Analysis. And lately I've been training nutrition-oriented practitioners in how to effectively use hair mineral analysis. I also do hair analysis consultations for individuals. So that's basically the background of how a psychologist got into nutrition with a special focus on hair mineral analysis.
Now, a lot of practitioners turn to just standard blood testing to look at mineral levels. Can you speak about the advantages that hair analysis has over, say, a blood serum test?
Right. Well, blood tests tend to reflect the components of the blood that are regulated by very powerful homeostatic mechanisms, which means that the blood will not allow minerals to go too far out of balance because that would produce very, very unhealthy reactions. So when you do blood tests, it may be a long time before the actual mineral deficiencies or mineral imbalances manifest in the blood or in the urine, for that matter. Whereas the hair analysis is a cell and tissue biopsy, and the hair analysis is able to pick up deficiencies or toxicities and ratio imbalances between pairs of minerals long before they'll show in the blood. And over the years, in working with different people, many people spent literally thousands of dollars pursuing all kinds of blood tests, urine tests, and x-rays and physical exams, searching for explanations for why they have certain physical and mental problems. Whereas we get a hair analysis, and in many of these cases, just a glance at the hair analysis reflects why they are experiencing so many health problems. Low energy, adrenal burnout from stress, a strong tendency toward a slow thyroid, copper toxicity, magnesium deficiency, glucose regulation problems, psychological problems with depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, ADD, bipolar disorder, and just on and on and on, that are very easy to detect and explain via the hair analysis and mineral deficiencies, mineral toxicities, and mineral imbalances.
Now, you had mentioned back in your 40s, you also had magnesium deficiency.
Right, I was 43 when I had such a severe magnesium deficiency that at the start of a 6-hour glucose tolerance test, my blood sugar was 45, which is so low it's just above being in a coma. And then with the glucose drink, it shot up to the 160s, and in the course of the 6-hour testing, it came crashing down to 35 at the end of 6 hours, with all of the horrible reactive hypoglycemic symptoms that go with a substantial, quick blood sugar drop. Yeah. Headache, shakiness, anxiety, and just awful feelings. And it was all related to a very, very acute magnesium deficiency.
Yeah, and that is such a common condition these days. Magnesium deficiency and copper dysregulation are two major epidemics
Absolutely.
That we're seeing. What has caused this?
Well, the magnesium deficiency tends to be related to the impact of stress, because it's so well established that stress depletes magnesium in such a way that it increases a person's need for magnesium. And if the person is not aware of that stress-magnesium relationship, they become more and more depleted in magnesium, like I was, to the point that you have severe glucose dysregulation. You have an increased risk of cardiovascular, and so on and so forth. So that's magnesium, primarily related to the impact of stress. The copper toxicity, one of the first researchers and authors writing about copper toxicity was Dr. Carl Pfeiffer, an MD and a Ph.D., who wrote a book called Mental and Elemental Nutrients that he published 40 years ago in 1975. And one of his chapters was on copper toxicity and its impact on health, particularly in women, because of the estrogen-copper connection. And what was determined is that the combination of copper exposure via water running through copper plumbing, plus the effect of estrogen with the birth control pill, and or copper IUDs, started to make many, many teenage girls and women more copper toxic. And over the generations, in the last 50 or 60 years, the population became progressively more and more copper toxic. But also, another important and interesting aspect of it is that a copper toxic teenage girl or young woman who became pregnant could also transfer some of her excess copper via the placenta into her fetus during a pregnancy, so that the fetus, when the baby was born more copper toxic than the mother or grandmother or great-grandmother. And so not only were female children being affected by the copper transfer in utero, but also male children, to the point now where we see a lot of young men or teenage males or boys who show similar copper toxic hair mineral patterns to females. And unfortunately, there's relatively few practitioners who are even aware of the copper toxicity phenomenon and health problems. And you have both mental and physical health problems associated with copper toxicity, because the copper toxicity builds up in the liver, making the liver sluggish, but it also builds up in the brain, where it triggers all kinds of psychological problems: bipolar disorder, ADD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, anxiety, panic attacks, intense fight-or-flight stress reactions, and just a whole host of mental problems.
I think people might turn to their practitioner to get tested for copper toxicity, and in fact they are toxic, yet their blood test will come back showing normal, or even a low level of copper. And so they're led to believe that they're fine. So where does this confusion come from? A copper toxic person having a test that comes back showing normal or even low levels of copper?
Well, when it comes to different kinds of tests, for one thing, you want to be aware of whether the test is accurate or not. And the hair analysis has a phenomenally high level of accuracy, just in terms of technical laboratory analysis. So the test is highly accurate. One of the big problems with hair analysis is, how do you make sense of the very accurate laboratory data and numbers? What do you relate it to? And do these numbers relate to the person's presenting health problems, physically and or mentally? And Dr. Eck and Dr. Watts were able to develop a set of concepts that related the hair mineral patterns to the thyroid, to the adrenal glands, to the parathyroid, and to glucose regulating mechanisms, so that the hair analysis data became highly relevant to understanding what was off in the person's mineral system.
And it also comes down to looking, not so much at the actual copper level, but more importantly, various ratios that indicate copper toxicity or deficiency.
Yeah, the basic research on hair analysis has clearly shown that copper toxicity, or as copper builds up to excess toxic levels, one of the clear-cut effects is to lower the tissue potassium level and raise the soft tissue calcium level, indicating soft tissue calcification, and a high ratio of calcium to potassium, which was interpreted as an index of slowing of the thyroid. And the diminished energy coming from thyroid activity often was getting misinterpreted as a manifestation of clinical depression, because one of the characteristics of clinical depression is low energy. But they didn't distinguish between a true psychological depression and depression and low energy associated with a slowing of the thyroid.
One of the examples you've used, which makes a lot of sense, is comparing available copper to biounavailable copper to being in the ocean, and you're surrounded with salt water. You got lots of water around, but you can't use it.
That's right. So there's a paradox. They have a buildup of toxic biounavailable copper that's having all kinds of physical and psychological adverse effects, and yet they're deficient in having copper bioavailable for normal healthy functions, including energy production. And so, It's like they're in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by a vast amount of water, but it's not drinkable. And so they could be dying of thirst, even though they're surrounded by water. And that's analogous to a person who has built up a copper toxic load in their liver and their brain, but it's not bioavailable in order to help with vital metabolic and cellular functions. So there's a paradox of too much, and yet they're deficient in healthy copper. And that's very often a confusing concept for a lot of professionals and a lot of lay people to grasp.
Right, and that's why I love that analogy of the ocean. That makes a lot of sense when you put it in that visual perspective. Mm-hmm. So one of the first places that bio-unavailable copper gets stored is in the liver. Right. Can you talk about, I guess, the typical symptoms that might manifest as the liver gets overburdened, and then after the copper accumulates to a certain level in the liver, it then goes to the brain, and then what typical symptoms might present themselves at that point?
Well, on a physical level, there's a more sluggish functioning of the liver where it can't detox what it needs to detox very efficiently. And so the person is more susceptible to building up all kinds of other toxins in the body. And then it can affect the gallbladder, it can affect digestion. Digestion problems are very common in copper toxic individuals. And so they're not able to absorb the necessary nutrients very efficiently. The copper building up in the brain tends to overstimulate the brain and throw the neurotransmitters off, and it produces a racing of the mind where thoughts race through a person's mind, and quite often when you hear them talking, they're talking a mile a minute. The words are just pouring out of their mouth, and you have to really pay attention to hear what they're saying because they're talking so fast. They also have problems with concentration and focus and begin to manifest symptoms that are easily misdiagnosed as ADD or ADHD. Many people with copper toxicity will also have sleep disturbances, problems falling asleep or staying asleep. They also will have problems in relationships because the copper toxicity throws off their stress ratio, sodium to potassium, where the sodium in many cases is higher than potassium, making the person much more reactive to stress, which then leads to manic kinds of behavior. It leads to anxiety and panic attacks. It leads to loss of emotional control, which then begins to adversely affect close relationships, intimate relationships, and family relationships. Also relationships in work situations or school situations, peer relationships. So there's all kinds of psychological problems that you can trace back to an underlying copper toxicity. If the copper builds up a calcium shell, it winds up numbing a person and really blocking their feelings and leaving them thinking that because copper is supposed to be related to emotions, that reflects true feelings of love or lack of love. But emotions also involve anger and rage, and also involve anxiety and panic. And so just to say copper is going to help a person with their emotions and help with their love life is oversimplifying it. It can also destroy relationships if there's a buildup of too intense a stress response. That would be the fight or flight response. The fight part is anger and rage, and the flight part is anxiety and panic. And if those emotions reach a point where a person's reacting instantaneously on a reflex level, that can lead to destruction of a relationship. So it needs to be understood in much more detail than just saying, well, copper's going to help with loving feelings. And as you're able to help a person detox the copper and reduce the copper load, that helps them reestablish more emotional control, more cognitive control, and helps them raise their functioning level quite dramatically. One of the other aspects of the copper toxicity, besides lowering the potassium level, as it builds the soft tissue calcification, that produces what I refer to as a calcium shell, which blocks feelings, numbs feelings, and puts a person out of touch with their true feelings. And that, again, can affect the person's emotional life and their relationships.
So with someone who has a calcium shell, would they just consider themselves to be normal or fine, or would they realize it?
No, a lot of times they don't realize it because their feelings are numbed so much by the buildup of excess calcium and copper. They're not even aware that their feelings are numb and deadened and cut off, and they're basically operating at a cognitive level and not a feeling level. And yet cognitively, they can convince themselves that they're thinking their way through their emotional life. And that simply is not the way it works psychologically.
In your book, Shrinking the Judge, Freeing the Inner Child, you talk about the judge, which is our dark, disempowering, kind of negative ego.
You can call it also the inner terrorist or the inner tyrant. In this day and age, with terrorism being in the news so much, we're shifting our terminology from calling it the inner terrorist to the inner tyrant.
That makes sense. Yep. So we've got the judge, we've got the inner child, which is based on, I guess the fear from traumatic childhood experiences.
Right.
And then the warrior archetype, which is our strong higher self. Is that correct? So can you share a little bit on how copper toxicity would affect these parts of one's personality?
Well, what I refer to as the judge or the inner tyrant is closely related to our stress experiences from childhood. Being criticized, being punished, being held to perfectionistic expectations, being verbally or physically or even sexually abused, highly stressful childhood experiences that accumulate and feed into the development psychologically of the judge around 8 or 10 years of age, when children normally think in terms of very concrete either-or distinctions, good or bad, right or wrong, black or white, acceptable, not acceptable, lovable, rejected, and so on and so forth. The simplistic either-or modes of thinking. And then that becomes embedded and imprinted into the person's brain and psychological development. Everybody develops some type of a judge or inner tyrant, because it's tied in so closely to the brain and nervous system and the way it's impacted by stress. And you don't have to have a psychiatric diagnosis to have a destructive judge affecting your life. Everybody's got a judge, including psychiatrists and psychologists. So the buildup of copper also intensifies the stress response. And so the buildup of copper can also inflate a person's judge, where it is constantly attacking and intimidating their inner child, which takes a toll on their self-esteem, makes them more depressed, more anxious, more insecure, much more distracted. And so copper toxicity plays a big role in triggering and inflating the judge psychologically. So a lot of copper toxic individuals experience the inflation of their judge as the copper toxicity intensifies the person's stress response. It's a very simple dynamic, but very profound in its impact.
So I've heard the stories from a lot of women who have been on various birth control, either the pill or the IUD, for many years, and then at the final stage, then they start realizing, oh my God, I've got all these symptoms that are suddenly happening, and I've heard it being talked about a lot. This copper threshold, where copper can build up almost quietly, over many, many years, but then a certain threshold is reached, and once that threshold is crossed, then a lot of symptoms start manifesting themselves. Would you agree with that? Or
that's a very good description. And you've done some very, very good research and investigative work to learn more about how the cumulative effect of the birth control pill, hormone replacement, and copper IUDs has absolutely devastated the health of countless numbers of women and teenage girls. And there's so little knowledge and awareness of the copper toxic phenomenon among health professionals and among the public and among the media. Even though 40 years ago, a brilliant MD like Dr. Carl Pfeiffer, the man had an MD and a Ph.D. He was a brilliant clinician and researcher, and he had figured out the copper toxic syndrome, basically. And yet he couldn't make any headway with his medical and psychiatric colleagues. And so a lot of his work was never picked up on, never further developed, and never brought into mainstream awareness and consciousness among health professionals and among the public and among legislators.
And this unawareness is just, so many lives have been destroyed as a result. And
it is, the lack of awareness has really cost people dearly in terms of their physical and or their mental health, their relationships, their families, their livelihoods, all kinds of aspects of living have been destroyed for lack of awareness. And it's not that difficult a concept to grasp. But it is a challenge to attract people's attention to take a serious look at the copper toxicity phenomenon and what its implications are.
So what, in your view, is the best or a good way to to detox and restore one's health? Can you just, take some zinc and hope for the best, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, I think it's more complicated than that because the copper detoxing process can temporarily stir up some of the most severe aspects of copper toxicity in terms of symptoms.
Such as?
I've had women say that their copper detoxing experience often feels like a combination of severe PMS together with flu-like symptoms. And so there's a substantial amount of discomfort that often occurs with copper detox.
How about the psychological symptoms?
With some people, it can actually bring out homicidal and suicidal feelings. It can intensify symptoms that mimic ADD, that mimic bipolar disorder, that mimic clinical depression, because the copper detox can also intensify the stress response. People going through a copper detox can instantaneously fly into anger and rage reactions or into anxiety and panic reactions so that their partner or spouse or other family members or co-workers may think they're going nuts when basically they're simply going through a very intense detox. So they need some support and understanding, and for people around them and for themselves to be aware that the detox is temporary. When I first started talking about hair analysis and copper toxicity more than 30 years ago in 1984, one of my overhead transparencies that I would use in my hair analysis seminars had an up and down curve that I referred to as the copper roller coaster. And I explained that people who are copper toxic need to make a decision about whether they're willing to ride the copper roller coaster in order to eventually restore much better health. And the paradox is that for most copper toxic individuals, their overall energy is greatly diminished. So you have to start with supplements that will build the adrenals and the thyroid and cellular energy. So as the energy comes up, they usually start feeling much better. But they reach a peak of energy, at which point the body then is able to start releasing the excess copper. And then it's like being at the peak of the roller coaster, and then you come zooming down. And so that's the downside of the copper detox. And then when that phase is over, things level out, and the energy starts to build up again, reaching a higher peak, and then another downswing as more copper is detoxed. And that's what I call riding the copper roller coaster. And so a lot of people can relate to that roller coaster effect. And so for most people, the copper detox will follow a roller coaster up and down pattern. And so it's important for them to be aware that's the nature of the copper detox phenomenon. Now, with some approaches like Dr. Wilson's, utilizing intense aggressive detox methodologies like coffee enemas and infrared saunas, that may accelerate the detox that also pulls out other vital electrolyte minerals like potassium, sodium, and magnesium that can leave a person extremely depleted, even though they've drastically cut down their copper very rapidly. Now, with a rapid copper detox, because it can affect psychological functions and reactions temporarily, it can throw some people into suicidal depressions or into manic and depressive reactions that easily get misdiagnosed as bipolar disorder. They could wind up in a psychiatric hospital on all kinds of psychiatric drugs that are very toxic. And so for most people, I suggest that they approach their copper toxicity issues very cautiously and slowly and see what they can tolerate. And zinc and manganese and vitamin C are primary nutrients to help with detox, as well as magnesium, potassium, vitamin A, and vitamin B6. So the detox is not an easy process for most people. It can be very discouraging, especially if the people that the copper toxic individual is relating to in an intimate relationship in their family. It's very easy to misunderstand what this copper toxicity phenomenon is all about, and the people around the copper toxic person may get scared and overwhelmed by the intense reactions of a copper detox phase. But if you understand the nature of copper toxicity and that it's a temporary phenomenon, then the person can get through those more intense reactions, and they need a lot of support and understanding, which very often they don't get. So the lack of understanding can make it very difficult for a lot of people.
How does adding zinc into a detox, if you add zinc into a detox too quickly, can that create negative side effects?
Yeah, it can accelerate the detox, which can overwhelm certain people. And one of the things you have to be aware of with copper toxicity, even though it's a general condition and syndrome that we can talk about and understand in general terms, the copper toxicity impacts different people in very individualized in different ways. So the way one person is impacted in response to copper toxicity and copper detox may be quite different from the way another person experiences it. So that biochemical individuality aspect is another aspect that's important to understand.
I think for vegetarians, it's even harder to detox.
Yeah, because usually they're extremely burned out. So they're feeling that their health and energy is very, very tenuous and precarious, and they become very, very obsessive. And so they're reactive to the slightest twinge or the slightest change in the way they're feeling and experiencing things.
Interesting. So if a copper toxic individual has a calcium shell forming and they're vegetarian, then those numbing feelings and the change in their lack of, their increasingly lack of feelings from the calcium shell is even amplified further because they're vegetarian?
Yeah, the vegetarianism, I think, is going to deprive them of vital nutrients from animal proteins and animal sources.
So how long can one generally expect the detox process to take? You talk about the roller coaster. Is it a matter of weeks or months? Or, I know stories where it's taken years.
In some people, it can be weeks, months, or even years, depending on the person, depending on how much copper they've built up. I've seen coppers go up as high as 60 in a copper detox, and the ideal copper in the hair analysis is 2.5, to give you some idea of the magnitude of a detox in some people. Whereas the breakup of the calcium shell might temporarily drive calcium up to 600 or even 12 or 1300 as the calcium shell breaks up with the copper detox. And then as the calcium shell breaks up, it's like an emotional dam has broken, and the person can be overwhelmed by a flood of feelings that have been blocked and denied and numbed for many, many years. And then all of a sudden the calcium shell breaks. It's like an emotional dam broke, and they're just overwhelmed by a flood of feelings. So they need a lot of emotional support to get through those crisis reactions.
Relationships are often the primary target in the psychological battle. As your copper increases and you begin detox, it's the primary relationship that often suffers.
Right.
So why would that be, as opposed to, say, your family or your work relationships? Why would romantic relationships be affected?
Well, because they're the more intense relationships. So there's a lot more intense feeling involved in romantic or intimate relationships. And they're cut off by a buildup of the calcium shell. The psychopathological reactions can be very limited and focused to certain relationships and situations, and the person can still manage to function quite well in other relationships and other situations. I would venture to say that divorce courts are loaded with people whose relationships were destroyed by copper toxicity, and because the role of the copper toxicity impacting the emotions and the thought processes and the behaviors is not understood, it leads to a lot of animosity, a lot of anger and resentment and revenge, and a lot of flare-ups of the judge psychologically and emotionally that ultimately winds up destroying the relationship.
Well, I sincerely appreciate your time, Dr. Malter. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
And it's been a pleasure talking to you, Rick.